podcast is brought to you by Neural Media. Are you an entrepreneur or maybe a marketer who wants to grow their business through content production? Maybe you're sick of dealing with agencies or want an outsourced solution that actually fits a budget? Well, Neural Media, our business, can help you with simple and affordable content production, saving you time and money by taking away that pain of producing the content. If you want to learn more, just head to neural.com/media, which is NEURALLE.com/media. Play around with our pricing, have a look at all the different options that you have, request or consider requesting a callback from me personally. If you have a friend that runs a business or is a marketer, do send them our way. It will help us keep the lights on and producing more juicy content. Listeners to this show receive a special discount by using the promo code UNCOMMON. If you want to learn yourself as to how to create content, maybe you want to make a podcast or your very own video, just download our free series on how to create a podcast and video at the very bottom of neural.com/media. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon, the podcast that helps you build your knowledge, skills, and mindset through interviews with unique individuals. My name's Jordan Michaelides, and I'm your host. In this episode, I have for you Nic Hodges. Nic is the founder of Blonde3 and former head of innovation for media brands such as Foxtel, NewsCorp, and MediaCom. Noted for his tagline, nostalgic for the future, Nic has always been dubbed a polymath by a few former guests, but I think particularly his understanding of the mechanics in media is what really sets him apart from the rest. Nic has a unique intersection of media and technology, a skill set to better help us understand the happenings in the background of social media. And so I couldn't help myself but get him back in, and I hope he comes back in year on year to talk to us about these happenings, so to speak. Again, this was a fairly meaty episode, that is, as was his original one on episode 64. In this one, we got into Batmania versus Melbourne, the state of media, propaganda and disinformation, some topics like the WhatsApp lynchings and impact of Twitter, responsibility, accountability, and free speech. And of course, we spoke about in-call and subscription services. So if you enjoy this episode, subscribe on your podcast app or consider leaving us a rating as well. Show notes and all previous guests you can find at neural.com/podcast. That's NEURALLE.com/podcast. As I say each week, thank you so much for listening, our regulars for coming back, our newbies for giving this a shot. I hope you all enjoy this conversation with Nic Hodges. Nic, thank you for joining me again on this, what time is it? 3:30 Friday?
It's a lovely Friday afternoon.
Yeah, I'm going to be having a good nap after this.
God, good for some.
I know. What are you up to after this?
More work, sadly.
More work, yeah. I mean, look, it's not all just naps. I've got to go do some reviews of some new leads and pack all this shit up. But yeah. I was thinking about like icebreakers like I normally do for each guest. And I notice even though you're off Twitter, the reference to Batmania. Do you reckon you prefer to have Melbourne be Melbourne or Batmania?
Oh, definitely Batmania.
Yeah.
Definitely Batmania.
Makes me wonder, like, if it had that name, I don't know, like it's such an obtuse name. I feel like cities with very obtuse names don't really stand out for, you know, being the name, but I don't know. It feels like Melbourne would be different.
I think from a branding perspective, it would worry me.
Yeah.
You know, like, so if you go into any aquarium in the world these days, there's Nemo crap everywhere. And I feel like that's what would happen with Melbourne. If we called it Batmania,
it'd be just shit everywhere.
There'd just be like this Batmania shit everywhere. Like people would just, they wouldn't be able to resist. They would run with it, and it would ruin the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I sort of like it as just a nice little, you know.
Unless Disney was in charge of our merchandising, then maybe.
Then it would definitely be ruined. Yeah.
It's funny. Like, I guess we just published this episode with Greg Sanderson, who runs like O2V, Ball and Maker House, those sort of venues in Melbourne. and we were just having a good old chuckle about Disney buying. Are you a Game of Thrones fan?
I've never watched a second of Game of Thrones.
Really?
Yeah.
Have you been like one that was into epics like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and stories like that?
Always loved Star Wars. Late comer to Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
I can't do violence.
Really?
So that's why I have nothing against Game of Thrones, and I'm sure it's amazing, but I can't do violence.
Okay.
So
why is that?
I don't know. I just don't like it. I can't watch it. I never watch anything violent.
Wow. Yeah, because I've always been one for epics. I was always brought up on, like, as I was telling someone recently, like, my grandfather used to tell me the story of Odysseus, like, for fun. Like, he wouldn't read the actual bloody book, but he would sit there telling me at night, like, the story of Odysseus. So, like, I've always loved those adventurous sort of tales, so to speak. But
that's very Greek.
It is very Greek. And my point is that I wish, in some way, that Disney had bought Game of Thrones, kept the same directors, same storytellers, so the story is still same quality, but they would just pump out way, way more. Because Disney is amazing at that.
There's still time. There's still time.
Yeah. I can't see, honestly, I can't see HBO selling that at all.
Oh, once they've thoroughly wringed everything they can out of it.
Apparently they're about to do a prequel series.
I think there's prequels, there's offshoots, aren't there? Like sort of there's going to be character offshoots and stuff. Yeah, and then once they're done, Disney will sweep in and
just,
you know, make a Lego version of it or something.
Just like wring it out like a wet shirt.
Yeah.
One of the things I didn't get to ask you last time was we were chatting about your sort of early years going into media, and you were sort of at this convergence of media and tech. You sort of initially had a bit of disgust around going into media, and I was curious, like, what was your preconceived notions? Like, why was that?
I wouldn't say it was disgust. I mean, part of it was just curiosity, and part of it was, I guess, an almost sort of tribal belief that creativity was the sole driver of outcomes when it came to sort of commercial creativity. When it comes to advertising and design, it's the work. It's, you know, what the people see is all that's important. And I'd spent a lot of time in meetings as a creative director with the media people, presenting to the client and talking through all these spreadsheets and stuff, and just going, this doesn't matter. It's only the ideas that matter, guys. So yeah, going to media was an interesting move, and it's why I think it's not unusual now. At the time, it was sort of, you know, there was the trade press was like, oh, you know, creative director going to a media agency, yeah, it was a strange thing to do, and I was somewhat doubtful, and then.
You were pleasantly surprised.
And then I was pleasantly surprised because I got in there. I was like, "Oh, it's all numbers," and I can do a bit of spreadsheet stuff, and I'm enough of a nerd like that I came to like it, and I came to see it as a system and as a machine, and that's the sort of fun part of it.
And we touched on why you like that sort of stuff, about the mentality you had as a kid in our earlier episode. I'm curious then, like, if you'd not gone into media, what do you reckon you would have done?
Look, that's a tough one, without admitting to the fact that I have a time machine. But, I mean, there's a bunch of directions that, you know, I've always sort of had in the back of my mind, whether that's actually, you know, probably going into startups back then, which is, you know,
I was going to say
now sort of more than 10 years ago. Or, you know, going in a completely different direction. I am originally an industrial designer. It's interesting that, you know, at the start of the 2000s, that was something that was really disappearing as a vocation in Australia. A lot of those jobs were going offshore, and it's interesting now that we sort of have seen a real resurgence in product design and industrial design, and, you know, Kickstarter is. For all the bad things it's done, Kickstarter has given people a distribution platform, and also taught a whole lot of people how hard it is to actually make something physical.
Yeah. I've gotten really deep into industrial designers or former sort of jewelers or artists that have been working in some sort of factory or place, and then they've just decided to start making their own stuff and putting it on Instagram. And so one of those little niches is people who make, I don't know if you've seen it, but they take old dollar coins, gold dollar coins, and put like artwork on it. There's about 6 or 7 of them that I've just started following, and it's quite amazing because they'll make like intricate little things, like an old knight, and then his sword is like in a rock, and when you press the sword down, like some other component moves on it. It's quite amazing.
Wow.
And it's just
You've gone down quite the rabbit hole here.
I really have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like initially I was looking at the sort of, do you know the Memento Mori coins by Ryan Holiday?
Yeah.
And so, I just, there's a guy, Ryan Boutine. I cannot remember if he's Russian or Dutch, but it's amazing because he'll put them on eBay and people start bidding. And I reckon in the early days they used to sell for like $400 or $500, and now a piece will start at like $1,700 and some will go up to like $10,000.
Yeah, wow,
it's quite amazing.
Not investment advice.
No, not investment advice. What's been happening anyway? It's been, I think last time you were here or when we published it was like July 2018.
Yeah, busy year, which is good.
Yeah.
The media space has been just fascinating. In almost the 12 months since I guess I was sitting here last, we've had layoffs at Vice, BuzzFeed, Mike shut down. The New York Times is posting amazing profits.
Yeah.
We've had Nine and Fairfax come together. We've had the ACCC announcing some interesting plans to look into parts of the Australian media industry.
Adpocalypse on YouTube.
We've had Adpocalypse. We've had probably several Adpocalypses on YouTube. The pivot to video is officially a failure. The pivot to paid is the new pivot to video.
Yeah, pivot to video, definite failure.
Yeah, massive failure.
Who merged recently? I was reading Digiday's video newsletter this morning. It was Warner Media, AT&T.
Yep. So that's finally. The US government stopped trying to sue them to stop that one.
Yeah, so that's all happened.
Yeah, more mergers. Disney, Fox.
Disney, Fox, that's right.
It's all happening. Consolidation, things failing, Mark Zuckerberg making promises, Jack Dorsey being a douche. I mean, I guess in that sense, nothing's really changed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think, we're in Australia. There's a New South Wales election in 2 weeks. There's a federal election in 3 months.
Yeah.
The disinformation piece, I think, probably from just the work I've been doing, but also from I think how the world has changed has been one of the most interesting narratives, I guess, in the last sort of 9 months as well.
Yeah, maybe let's get into that first because I'll come back to trends later because you gave me this little beauty here, the what does it say? The tactics and tropes of the Internet Research Agency.
Yeah,
there you go, fans. If you can see that, we'll make sure we give it a link, but. This is amazing to read, just to see what, I guess, propaganda machines, which basically the IRA is like a marketing agency, but for propaganda for the Russian government. Yeah,
Russian marketers. I mean, I feel...
It was quite amazing just reading it and see what they've done, like, and how they influenced the last election.
Yeah, no, it's the tactics, the methods. It's interesting that... I feel like a lot of people aren't as well informed around what's been happening in disinformation. The sort of Mueller inquiry has been a really interesting opportunity to have things exposed that otherwise wouldn't have been exposed. And the Cambridge Analytica inquiry as well, the FTC's done, has given us a view on things that we just wouldn't have seen otherwise in terms of just the sheer volume of I guess we call it work, the sheer volume of work that the IRA was pumping out, and also some of the tactics, techniques from media planning and execution to creative. I guess we're going to call it the work, and we're going to call it the creative. To sort of social engineering and some of how they've leveraged a lot of cognitive biases.
Yeah.
And Look, I don't think it's probably gotten enough volume in terms of mainstream attention. But one of the most interesting things is that marketers seem pretty up to date with it, because it's fascinating. It's literally just sort of turning a lot of those growth tactics that businesses have and using growth platforms at a global scale that technology companies have created, and it's using those things for bad.
Well, what I realized when they were doing that, so it's the obvious things like targeting tags, and the use of memes to me was quite interesting, and it made me think about, like this whole battle on YouTube with T-Series and PewDiePie, and why has PewDiePie always been so famous and well loved? It's because I think of memes and the power of memetic culture. So there's all those little things, but it made me realize, the power of these platforms and how the IRA would focus on very specific topics. Like they would have multiple niche brands, but like, let's say if they were to cover the black community, they would cover 3 or 4 different arms of that, like Black Power versus conservative blacks, like all these different groups and the way that they would target them for different things.
Yeah.
And also just the nuance that they had an understanding of, I don't know, like US culture as well.
Yeah.
And how they would change it post-election. We never got to talk last time about propaganda. I think, obviously I've read that. I've read a shit ton of Edward Bernays since then, like every book that he's published. Maybe you could just talk about this element of disinformation. Like, how do you think that is going to change how we use these platforms, if at all? Because we've had these reviews, these Senate committee reviews, and I don't really see much changing.
No, look, I mean, I guess there's a few answers to that. One is whether we see meaningful change. I think we'll see meaningful change. I'll probably park that there. But I imagine that's going to happen.
Okay.
I guess.
What is a meaningful change, though?
I think we'll see an attempt at self-regulation.
Okay.
And if that fails, I think we will see regulation by the markets in which there is a large financial incentive for regulation to be abided by.
Okay.
So one of the challenges that you have with these platforms is that they're global. So who regulates them? And do we? I think it probably isn't the right approach to give Facebook a seat at the UN. That's probably a bad idea. So one of the arguments that lobbyists working for the Facebooks and the Googles of the world like to put out there as well, who is going to regulate this? Almost as a bit of a challenge of, see, you can't even do it. But the fact is that, the ARPU for Facebook, the ARPU for Google is highest in the US, significantly higher, an order of magnitude higher than any other emerging market. But even, so I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm going to say Facebook somewhere in the realm of $30 versus more like sort of 10, 12 for Europe. And similar-ish for Australia. But then, you go to the Philippines, the ARPU is $1.50.
Yeah.
So, you regulate in the areas where the financial incentive is there to actually regulate.
Just for people who don't understand, ARPU is your average revenue per user.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, look, I guess to answer the question around, what happens now, I think platforms are starting to understand how they can be exploited. I don't think that they're just oblivious to this, and I think that they're increasingly willing in the face of regulation and just in the face of the decline of their brand in a way. One of the major brand reports came out this week, and Facebook has dropped from somewhere in the 40s in terms of the most positively viewed brands in the US down to 90-something in the last 6 months.
Right.
Do
you know what that who that brand report was by?
I will have to.
I was just wondering if it was.
Put it in the show notes.
I was just wondering if it was L2 Inc.
No, it wasn't L2. It was I'll have to look up who it was, but
Yeah.
I mean this impact on their brand is really going to be part of the drive for change, and just the fact that, you know, at the end we can sort of talk about Facebook and make jokes about Zuckerberg being a robot, but there are humans that work there, and those humans do, you know, for the most part, at YouTube or at Twitter or at Facebook or at TikTok or wherever, they don't want to destroy democracy, so they're going to be open to making change.
Yeah. And I just wonder if they're going to be quick enough to do it before government step in. Like, and I say that, but I know you're not a fan of Jack Dorsey, and we were talking before about his 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan, Tim Pool, and I believe it's his head of policy. So it was very interesting, and I don't know. I don't know that I definitely believe that they're fully aware as to what's happened and they can identify it and so forth. I just don't know that, you know, like it just doesn't feel like there's an incentive for them to go balls deep on getting this thing fixed, if you know what I mean. Like they've got an incentive brand wise to fix some things up, but you could just tell in the conversation when they spoke about the impact of algorithms on their platform, and not understanding that they may have a political bias, or that these bots can impact things more than they believe that they can. That was like very obvious to me based on listening to that interview.
Yeah, and look, I guess to specifically talk about Twitter, I would say I'm not terribly concerned about Twitter. Since Twitter's actually published DAU numbers, it's evident how insignificant Twitter is.
Yeah, on numbers, yeah, but I would argue on political discourse, no. I think that it's probably the most important platform for the you know, the propagation, the initial ideas that get spread out through the ether.
Yeah, no, I disagree with that and say that Twitter is not changing minds.
Okay.
Twitter's not changing minds. Twitter is not inflaming,
in a mass sense, yeah,
grassroots. It's not having an impact.
But it's more academic. There's more people there that initiate the ideas.
There's a lot of look. There's a lot of media folk there, and it's a media folk echo chamber. But in terms of, is Twitter as dangerous to the world as Facebook or as YouTube? Absolutely not. You know, Twitter is not turning anybody into a flat earther. Twitter is not enabling rallies of tens of thousands of neo-Nazis. Twitter is not changing anybody's mind. And it's not pulling anybody into a rabbit hole of hatred and of bigotry and of just blinkered views. And it just doesn't have the scale to do that.
Yeah,
it's a terrible place. Don't get me wrong. It's like it's the cesspit of the internet.
I hate it.
But it's in the context of this discussion, it's harmless.
Do you have shares in any of these companies at all?
No.
Okay. Not
directly.
Not directly. So. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I looked at a few different things that have happened of late via just this idea of propaganda and looking at certain ideas, and the scariest one to me was that case in India, the cases in India 2017-18 that commenced on WhatsApp and resulted in 47 people being killed through lynchings.
Yeah.
That to me is one of the scariest things and no one talks about it in the West.
And so this is the thing. People are talk about Twitter. Like and people on podcasts love to talk about how Twitter is the cesspool of the internet and Twitter's destroying democracy and stuff. Like, you know what's destroying democracy? WhatsApp. Like, WhatsApp is directly responsible for people being lynched. It's directly responsible for murders. And that's not I guess an interesting narrative. That's harder to understand. And that's where some of the scary stuff is. And I mean, yeah, it's the stuff that's often harder to understand and harder to explain, which is where a lot of the danger's lying at the moment. I mentioned TikTok, and there's TikTok is quickly becoming a huge platform, and it's run by a Chinese company. Let's put that to one side. But only lately has some of what's going on that platform actually come to surface, and there's just a lot of bad stuff going on there.
What are some examples?
There are guns being sold on there. There is child porn on there.
Really?
There's neo-Nazi content on there. Similarly with YouTube in the last couple of weeks, there's been what really you can sort of, you can't go out and say there is pedophilic content on YouTube, but there has been this use of commenting is a fascinating thing. There's neo-Nazi content all over YouTube in the sense that there is coded language in the comments, and now it turns out there's also pedophilic content on YouTube in the sense of coded language within the comments.
Yeah.
And so people are searching, and again, people go down these rabbit holes and they become surrounded by a community of themselves, of people like them. And whether that's neo-Nazis or pedophilia, I think most people agree that it's better if those people don't form communities.
Yeah, at least, yeah. I think you're 100% on that. And with that example as well, it was like kids, like 12-year-old kids doing gymnastics.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that there would be like timestamps when they were in promiscuous positions.
Yeah, so people were leaving comments with the timestamps and so therefore searching for essentially a community formed around these comments, and you could watch these commenters go around the internet.
Yeah, Phil DeFranco covered that a lot recently. I think it sort of really came to a head last week. I remember YouTube's initial release was like, you're responsible for your comments on your videos. That was their response initially. And then they had to backpedal and say, oh, no. Like as in, we'll disable comments and we'll have to review comments on these specific topics now. And yeah.
And so, and this is the challenge. So you often hear people talking about some of these things, and it's like, these platforms don't want to fix all these problems. But it's a bit of it's a bit like you're in a dark kitchen full of cockroaches with a torch. Like you sort of swing the torch around and there's another cockroach there. And, no one was talking about, pedophilic coded language on YouTube 3 months ago.
Yeah,
so
and bang, it's there.
So they couldn't go and fix it. So the problem is that there is, it's like Bruce Schneier talks about these ideas of class breaks. The fact is we've built technology that has scaled to such a point that when something breaks, the entire class of that thing breaks. And so the neo-Nazis can start using coded language in their video comments, and then the pedophiles can use coded language in their video comments, and then, the regular run-of-the-mill, Unite Australia, racists can start using it. And so these things break on a class level and on a global level. And so, it's whack-a-mole. It's massively whack-a-mole.
What do you think about making changes for these things? Like, there's obvious things that we don't want on certain platforms, but then again, you can find it on other platforms like LiveLeak and 4chan and whatnot. And this is one of the things that was raised in that Twitter discussion, and it was Tim Pool in particular who raised it, is like you said, whack-a-mole. Like, how much of it can we really regulate, ban, shadow ban, whatever?
Yeah, and look, there's sort of prior art here. There's quite often with things on the internet, I feel like there's not prior art, or at least people, or quite often people go, well, what's different this time? But I think piracy represents an interesting corollary here, which is they tried to, the MPAA and RIAA and various lobbyists and copyright agencies around the world tried to shut down piracy.
Okay.
They went and they shut down Napster, and then they shut down Kazaa and LimeWire, and they've tried to shut down BitTorrent. In Australia, they've been successful at shutting down torrent sort of the distribution sites for the torrents, and literally, creating a like the world's smallest firewall is in Australia, where, you can't access 20 websites. And what happened was, trying to stop those things didn't achieve anything. In a lot of cases, it made the technology better. Every step that I just described then of shutting something down made the distribution speed and the decentralization of that content more advanced. The thing that kills piracy is Spotify and Netflix. The thing that kills piracy is $10 a month, all you can eat.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like a different model is required here. We can't keep on sort of just whack-a-moling things. We can't sort of just expect them to shut things down, because rightly, people are going to go elsewhere. The alt-right started getting kicked off Twitter, so they created Gab. Mm-hmm. And now if you think that Twitter is a cesspit, my God, go and check Gab. Mm. So I think that driving people away from these platforms probably isn't going to work. No. One of the, it's something that obviously I've been thinking about a lot, and it's a hard problem to solve. And one of the most interesting sort of areas that I've come across is this idea that what's the midpoint of responsibility? So on one end of this spectrum, we have full accountability for information. So media companies are held to this, the far end of the spectrum, which is you're accountable for what you say. And if you within this framework of regulation around slander and libel, if you report something that's false, you're liable for it. And a publisher can end up in court for printing the wrong thing. So that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have companies that exist as platforms, and they're protected by some form of safe harbor law. Pretty much everywhere in the world has a form of safe harbor law. And, going all the way back to the idea of, so ISPs are sort of the easiest explanation these days. It goes all the way back to the telephone network and the postal network. The postal network can't be responsible for what's inside an envelope. Mm. The ISPs can't be responsible for you, not that I'm saying you are, for somebody pirating a movie. Yeah. The ISPs can't be held responsible for that. And that's the safe harbor laws, and they make a lot of sense. And that is the law that the YouTubes and the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world very much use as a shield. We're a platform, so we're not responsible. Now, I wonder if there's a midpoint. And the sort of distinction is, as soon as you start directing people, as soon as you start using that content that you are saying you are simply a safe harbor for, that you're simply a platform for, as soon as you start analyzing that and using that analysis in a way, in any way at all, you're starting to act like a publisher. Mm. So as soon as you start looking at, if you're YouTube, as soon as you start looking at the viewing behavior of people and tags and comments, and start saying, well, people who watch this video might want to watch this, so we'll recommend that to you next, you're making an editorial decision, and you should be held accountable for that decision. Mm. And a huge percentage of video watched on YouTube comes from recommendations. It's like around 80% of all videos viewed on YouTube come from recommendations. So that to me is not a platform. Mm. No one's putting their video up on YouTube and then saying, oh, and if someone's watched this, you should recommend that they watch this next. No one's doing that. People are putting their own content up on YouTube, and then YouTube are analysing that, and they're making decisions that are essentially driven by revenue because they want engagement.
They want people to sit on the platform. Yeah,
they want people to stay on the platform. But the problem is, you look at flat earthers, and there was a piece of research recently that basically showed that 99.9% of all flat earthers, and there are more flat earthers on the planet right now than there ever been in the history of civilization, which is just hilarious. Yeah. But
just to give context with how ridiculous the flat earther thing is, I was watching a Joe Rogan podcast and he had Alex Jones on to explain himself and everything that's happened in the last 6 months. And even Alex Jones, who's an absolute nutbag, was looking at Eddie Bravo, who's a mate of Joe Rogan's, and could not believe that he believes in flat Earth.
Yeah. But and if you look at these people, 99.9% of them became flat earthers because of YouTube. And that was some research that actually has been done. That wasn't just me making that up. And this, comes back to this idea of a community, that suddenly the craziest idea in the world, you can quickly go down a rabbit hole where you feel like you're part of a community who all share this belief, and you just sort of enter into an echo chamber. And that, interestingly, is simply the side effect of revenue generation.
Yeah, it's that to me. There's another element to that as well. Something that I've been, I guess, looking at over the last 6 months is, particularly after I heard this this talk by Niall Ferguson, who's a historian, and he spoke about I think it's The Tower and the Square, and it's his recent book about how public discourse, like this age of social media and platforms, has been as big as the Gutenberg press. And we've all moved on to online, essentially social square platforms. And in certain countries like the US, we've got a digital bill of rights, like free speech, and you can't be censored and all these sort of things. But you also can't just go out there and start parading hate speech. Like there are implications to what you can't be violent. Like violence is a form of speech in a way. You're stopping other people from speaking, from existing in the square. So I have wondered about, yes, I do agree that these platforms sort of need to go down the arm of sort of content regulation or being viewed as publishers, quasi-publishers platforms. But do we also need to hold individuals accountable? Like bringing back to that example on WhatsApp, they are sort of accountable in the eyes of the law when they start committing acts in person. But, things like doxing, that's some pretty serious shit.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the challenge that I would suggest there is that this sort of wonderful Petri dish of a world we live in, your idea falls apart when you consider that the largest by population and by power countries in the world are the US, which has a troublingly addictive idea about free speech. Russia, which I'm not going to say any more on. China, which I don't need to say any more on. And India.
Yeah.
So, the idea about starting to hold individuals accountable for free speech across those 4 countries is the outcome there would be vastly different, and while fascinating, would probably not be beneficial for the sort of advancement of human civilization.
So in a nutshell, you think the smartest moves from here, after all that we've learned about the IRA, everything that's happened in the last 2 to 3 years in particular, all the research you've done, that it's regulation of the platforms as publishers that have, and their data, that have potential financial implications?
No, I think that's the second most potentially positive thing we can do.
What's the first?
I think the first is essentially the evolution of our understanding of knowledge and communication. And that's a slow process, but it was a slow process throughout the late 17th and 18th centuries as well.
What do you mean by that, though?
Well, so probably the best articulation of this that I've come across was a paper by Henry Farrell and Bruce Schneier. And it was called Attacks on, or sort of Common Decency Attacks on Common Knowledge, I think it was. And what they presented was a really relatively simple, but a really powerful idea, which is that essentially since the printing press, so since really the church was sort of
separated from state.
Yeah, well, yeah. So we had a long period where the church was the arbiter of information.
Yeah, and then we had the Reformation,
and then we had the Reformation, and we have
Treaty of Westphalia.
Yeah, and so then we had a sort of a new model of knowledge, and we had Bacon, and we had the scientific method, and we had all this new way of thinking about knowledge. The fact that you shouldn't necessarily trust everything anybody says to you. We sort of naturally built in this sort of Bayesian inference into information, where if we heard it from multiple places and if we heard it from places with authority, where the last time we heard something, it was probably true. So we're now sort of 500 years into that model. And now with these global scale platforms, that model is challenged. And the model, as Schneier and Farrell talked about it, was really simple and quite elegant, which is that we have two types of knowledge. We have common knowledge and we have contested knowledge.
Okay.
And interestingly, dictators have seemed to naturally understand this. And dictators in the past have done something surprisingly simple. Through their control of information, they make common knowledge contested knowledge, and they make contested knowledge common knowledge. So contested knowledge are the things that we should be having debates about in public. They're ideas that we should debate. They are, to the simplest way of looking at it through a political lens, they are, should we increase the amount of welfare, or should we decrease the amount of welfare? Should we increase tax? Should we decrease tax? These are things that we don't have an answer for, and through information we can talk about them and make some level of informed decision, and through democratic process, in that case, a democratic decision. So that's contested knowledge. Now, common knowledge is the stuff that we all agree on. And in the case of politics, the idea that the election that we use as the tool to make the decision on the contested knowledge, the idea that election will happen, will be fair, will be unbiased, and will not be interfered with, that is, in a functioning democracy, that is common knowledge. We all agree on it. Now, putting technology to aside, dictators have done a very good job for hundreds of years at flipping those two things. Making people think that the contested knowledge, the idea that somebody else should be in power, or that things should be different, that, socialism is bad or socialism is good, making people not even question that. And interestingly, a lot of the time, dictators and police states did that simply by killing the people who challenged, who tried to create the contested knowledge. And amazingly, when you just start killing people, contested knowledge comes common knowledge pretty quick.
Yeah.
And the other thing they do is they turn the common knowledge into contested knowledge. So if there's going to be an election, no one thinks it's going to be fair anyway. So what's the point? And if you now put technology back on the table and you think about, the what the IRA has been doing, it's exactly that model. If you look at, and this is where, we skim over the top of Russian interference. The people are using this term, Russian interference, without really going and looking at the creative. And
yeah, the creative is amazing.
You actually look at the creative, and what is the creative trying to do? The creative is trying to
division.
Is trying to create, but it's trying to take things that we thought were common knowledge. A lot of it is trying to question the validity of an election. It's trying to question the value of a vote. There was a lot of activity that the IRA put out for the presidential election that was telling people that they could or they couldn't vote in the wrong way. It was completely changing what the common knowledge was, and for the first time in probably, the history of US democracy, you had people who weren't even sure how to vote. You had people who thought they could SMS their vote in. So common knowledge became contested knowledge, and contested doesn't mean that people were even aware it was contested. It was just that they were confused about it.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, the ability to target, the ability for people to surround themselves with a community like themselves, and then the ability for a bad actor, and in this case the IRA, to come in and target those people, those communities, turn contested knowledge into common knowledge. It allowed messages around, immigration that should be contested. There should be a debate about the value that immigrants bring to a country. There should be a debate that has data brought to the table that shows, and in this case, that shows that immigrants bring higher value to a country than someone born within a country. But if you've got a community of people that have formed around an idea, and then you allow someone to come in and pay money to advertise and to land a message in there, what should be contested knowledge, something like a discussion around the value of immigration and how much should be allowed in the country, that gets wiped out and that becomes common knowledge.
So it just becomes a statement, and it's particularly around topics around identity, like immigration.
It becomes tribal, yeah. And so and so now the common knowledge is, no, immigration is bad within these communities.
Well, it's the assumption that immigration is bad and immigration is good. There's no nuance in between. There's no discussing about why it's good or how it's good, or why it's bad or how it's bad. It's only one or the other. Yeah.
And so this is, this contested knowledge and common knowledge sort of idea, I think, is a really, when you sort of say, the best thing we could do is to regulate, I actually think the best thing we can do is to find simple ways to talk about the way that information and knowledge is changing, and to make sure people understand that. And by talking about that, and that's not going to be a fast process, but we can probably get there.
So was this another sort of essay, or was this a book?
No, this was an essay. It's a relatively short essay, and
Farrell and
Bruce Schneier, and it was common knowledge attacks on democracy.
Okay.
It's a perfect example where I think it's not an easy to read thing, but it's probably 15 pages.
Oh, okay.
And so I would say to anybody listening to this, go out and read that paper, and the ideas in it are relatively simple, and have conversations about that idea, and seek out ideas around how these platforms are changing the way that knowledge and information spreads, and have conversations about that, because when it's only when we sort of understand something that we can, that we can actually have a look at it and say, well, this is bad, this is good, or this is just how we need to consider things.
What are the papers? You gave me that New Knowledge Project paper. There's this one. What else have you read in the last 12 months in particular that's formed a lot of your opinion since then?
The always hated question that I get of, where do you read things and what have you been reading?
I know, and I was asking you this before we started, but I'm just curious, because obviously I feel like this document and that one as well seemed very, at least in the last 12 months, very seminal to you, very important. Yeah,
look, I mean, the New Knowledge one actually has a very interesting little sort of little postscript to it, which is the guy that wrote it has since been, I wouldn't say discredited, but has been ousted from New Knowledge because it turned out he was using a lot of these questionable tactics in a US, some form of US election.
Oh, really?
That he was working for.
What was the election?
I can't remember what was the last round of elections that they had was sort of their Senate elections or whatever. So he was working for a politician. And
they had their midterms.
Yeah, their midterms. So I believe it was in the midterms, but he was using some of these tactics for a relatively small campaign, but it was still when you're working in this realm and doing this type of research, you can't. It's probably best not to go and do that.
Yeah. Has this sort of affirmed the belief in your head about the importance of blockchain towards this media space? We spoke generally about censorship resistance and having a better system in the industry. And I know since then you went to work or did some work with Inkle. They've got Spot.
Yep.
I'm curious as to how this has changed or affirmed your belief.
Look, it probably hasn't affirmed. It probably hasn't strengthened it in the sense that one of the from first hearing about blockchain and understanding the concept of where it is applicable, I had ideas around media on how it could be applicable, and I think it still is. I think it's a long process. A lot of people thought it was a sprint. It definitely isn't, but look, blockchains are fantastic for creating economic markets around incentives. And if we look at media in the world today, whether it's how broken the digital media revenue model is in terms of advertising, and the amount of fraud and the amount of middlemen and just the sort of general state of the ad tech industry, it's still extremely relevant for that. And then going all the way up the spectrum to the idea of authenticity and verification and things like that. Who is it that's advertising to you? And who is it that's actually publishing this piece of content? Again, that ability to have sort of a verifiable and secure and trustless, but totally trusted sort of service in there is still extremely attractive.
Yeah, and also very hard to implement. Very
hard to implement, but you know what? Yeah. So is HTTP.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. Yeah, I've read the Spot paper. It's super fascinating.
Yeah, and look, I think I still keep in touch with a bunch of people working on blockchain projects in media, and I do keep on reminding them that it's a marathon, not a sprint. But I think we'll start to see how those things come to light. In the next 3 or 4 years, hopefully, and some of the prototypes actually making a difference.
Yeah. Now, this reminds me of the trends, which we didn't cover earlier. I know last time we spoke, we were briefly discussing this idea of the ad-driven media business sort of being an anomaly in time. And I know that when I was listening to that Niall Ferguson speech, he spoke about that as well. It's only really existed since maybe the late 1860s to early 1870s. Post sort of that robber baron era is when it really started coming about. Now, I love listening to DigiDay, but it's sort of, to me, they've just been talking about the same old shit
for the last... The pivot to paid.
Well, the pivot to fucking everything. It's like you're doing subscriptions, video, merchandise, services, events. Services could be like a podcast agency or like a full service agency or this or that. What do you think, what probabilities do you see being like 80% certain happening over the next 5 years?
80% over the next 5 years?
Yeah. Is it that businesses are definitely going to have diversified revenue? Like the idea of this sort of ad-driven, just ads only is that's just a bygone era? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, look, okay, so there's a bunch of angles on this. The model in 5 years will not be the same for media as it is now.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, the challenge that the challenge that media had around yield, around how much money they could make off a page of content, was driven, and I don't need to bang on about this, it was driven by Facebook and Google. Now, the question that I can't answer with 80% accuracy is, will regulation around data, which will happen, it's separate to this idea about what happens to platforms, regulation around data is happening, will that impact the ability of essentially platforms to offer advertising opportunities to brands for less than what the media companies could?
Yeah. And just to touch on that was when we were speaking about it potentially becoming like a liability on your balance sheet.
Yeah. So as we, so I talked about this idea of media, of advertising supported media being a bit of an anomaly. It may be that an even shorter anomaly is this idea of hyper-targeted data-driven advertising turns out to be a sort of 20-year anomaly because of data regulation, and it will become a liability to have that data, and it will become impractical and unprofitable to actually use that data. So I wouldn't say that's going to happen with 80% accuracy, but I would say that data is going to make some of these advertising models that have that have created the challenge for media companies, it's going to make some of those advertising models more of a challenge. And so the question there is, does any of the money actually flow back to the media companies? So there may be, I like to put a ray of light out there for the media folk, but there may be a ray of light there. But ultimately, I think there needs to be a new model. And you say things like that, and you imagine all these sort of startup founders in the background, sort of scribbling away, trying to build the new model and come out with the new model. And that's not how it's going to happen. It's going to happen because it's going to be messy, and there's going to be, all this stuff needs to get thrown into a big pile, and it needs to get jumbled up, and things need to fail, and we have to, we have to have the failures, and slowly a new model will emerge. It's not going to emerge with, Jonah Peretti sort of just declaring that BuzzFeed is the new model, or Shane Smith declaring that Vice is the new CNN. Like that's not the way this industry works.
Well, the new model just presents itself. Yeah.
Well, the new model does.
Someone just does it.
The new model will self-emerge, and it will slowly self-emerge, and it will emerge from pieces of things, and parts of what BuzzFeed did will form part of it. Parts of what Vice did might form part of it. Parts of what the information is doing. Parts of what Ben Thompson is doing. All these things will sort of merge and slowly build what is a new model. It's not it's not a Silicon Valley, there's no kid working in a garage that's about to come up with the new model for media. It's not how it works.
What would you be doing if you were starting a media business today? If you had to start a media business?
Not raising money.
Yeah.
I think that if there's, like I said, there are things that have come out of the BuzzFeed and the Vice models that we'll learn from for building the next set of media companies. And probably the greatest lesson out of those two businesses is don't raise money.
And so you just focus on selling and creating great content and offering many different options to make money, whether it's subscriptions or events or whatever. Yeah,
do things of value. And, that's easy to say, and it's nice for me to say all the information on Ben Thompson, but, everyone's just expensing that stuff.
Yeah.
But, look, Spotify and Netflix have now been around long enough that we're starting to get a generation of people that are happy paying for content. We're seeing this with Inkle, which is a news app where we've got thousands of people who are happy to pay $10 a month to access stuff that some of it they couldn't access. There is, whether it's sort of Wall Street Journal or Fairfax content that would be behind a paywall normally, but they're happy to pay it, and it's not. It's about the convenience. It's about the curation. It's about the quality. And Inkle's very much a consumer sort of piece of technology, much like Spotify, much like Netflix. And so, I absolutely think it's feasible that, you can actually start a business and from day dot almost start creating things of value and getting people to pay for them.
Inkle's an interesting one. Well, why did you think that was the next place to go?
Look, to be honest, the first time I met with Gotham, the founder of Inkle, when he was starting it, I thought it was absolutely not the next place. This was at a time when Facebook was dominating media distribution, and anybody that you spoke with at any of the large publishers was working on building a Facebook audience. It was when Facebook sort of promised that if you paid money to build your audience, you'd then be able to reach your audience and drive traffic. And that was, everyone... No one was stupid. Everyone thought they were genuine in that, and no one realised that they were just going to then turn that tap off and say, well, now you've got to pay to reach all these people that you paid us money to build up. And funnily enough, now nobody trusts Facebook. But
and instant articles as well.
Instant articles, pivot to video, all that. So, at the 5 years ago when Inkle started, the narrative was very much, well, these distribution platforms are what's going to save media companies, because media companies can now get their brand back, they can get their audience back, and they can reach them over these new platforms, drive traffic, and even with horrendous yields, they will make it up in volume. And what's happened in the 5 years since then is that every media company or every worthwhile media company has realised that that's not really the case. They've watched page yields go down. They haven't been able to collect the data sets, probably for the best in the long term, the data sets that will one day become a liability, to allow the super pinpoint targeting. So they became less valuable to advertisers. And so therefore, over the 5 year period, pretty much everyone now, to use DigiDay's favourite phrase, is looking at a pivot to paid. And they're in this, thanks to Trump and thanks to this concept of fake news that simply did not exist 4 years ago. Thanks to that term, the brand power of a trusted media brand is now big enough that you can actually convince people to hand over cash.
Yeah.
And the biggest challenge now that media companies have is that you only have to hand over money to Spotify or Apple Music, or if you're a weirdo like me, Tidal. But if you want to be an informed person in the world, you're not going you're not just going to hand over your money to Fairfax. You want, it's Fairfax, and is it the New York Times, and is it FT, or is it South China Morning Post, or and so suddenly this simple idea of, well, you just pay $10 a month for watching all the telly you watch or listening to all the music you watch hasn't quite. The media industry hasn't quite gotten there. They realise they need to get people paying, and they're living in a world where people will pay, but they're all still their own islands. Yeah. So something like Inkle, which brings those things together, is extremely powerful.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mention Ben Thompson, who runs Stratechery. That's who you're referencing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was talking about, is it Apple News? No,
yeah.
Apple News.
Apple News is
they're about
slowly
to launch,
building a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, they're about to launch a service offering. And so I was curious about that. Is that going to impact Inkle, do you think?
No.
Why is that?
Ben Thompson's an interesting one because he's the classic example of the gel man amnesia effect, where I always listen to Ben Thompson and go, yeah, it's really smart. And then I listen to him talking about media and I go, yeah, you actually don't know what you're talking about. No, publishers aren't terribly interested. They're not sold on Apple's model.
The whole pitch that they're offering.
Apple wants to take too much money. This is Apple's sort of third crack at this, and the previous two times they've failed quite dismally, and they also haven't lived up to the expectations that they promised publishers. So, I can't see publishers being excited by it. There's then the problem that you are still limited to an audience of iOS users, which admittedly is generally a sort of higher household income and a better advertising demographic. But that is a limit. And Android is increasingly having market share with sort of higher household income, higher demos. And then you have on top of that the fact that the actual experience is not great. And so I hear a lot of people sort of talk to me about Apple News, and they're sort of like, oh, well, this is going to be a huge thing. I'm like, have you actually used Apple News?
I've never used it.
So go in and use it, and it's an absolute steaming pile of crap. The headlines you get are just absolute nonsense. They're all from like 9 News, and they're all just the most sort of clickbaity, this celebrity self-combusted at Bondi sort of stuff. And even if you try and train it, and, I tried to tell it what I was interested in, and these, please ignore these publishers and things like that. And it's still just, as a platform, sort of fails. So there's that problem. And the final problem I think that Apple will have is one that is tied into the publisher challenge, which is cannibalization.
Okay.
What Apple are trying to get people to do is to use Apple News instead of going to Safari.
Yeah, they don't want to, Safari, Chrome, whatever.
Yeah, and so
it could work to their favour though, in the long run.
Well, but the publishers know because they've seen the numbers before.
They know now. They've got the Facebook warning.
That what happens is every dollar that they're going to pick up from Apple, which is actually only 50 cents, is a dollar that has just left their site, that was already going there. So, Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I don't, there's an 80% prediction that it's not going to be around in 5 years.
Yeah, I'm going to have a look at that. I also want to do some comparisons with Inkle because, like I said before this, I was looking at my own subscription at the moment. So, I think people should go check it out. It's pretty cool. There's a lot in there, a lot of different subscriptions that you get for that one subscription.
Yeah, a lot of great. A lot of it's, publicly available. So the Guardian, the ABC, things like that. But then there's also the FT, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fairfax, Economist, and the curation piece and the human curation piece is really, really central to it as well. And it's sort of a great example of this idea that we're still so far off, robots, really actually curating smart things.
No. Yeah, that to me, particularly after the election and looking at bots and stuff like that, I feel like I can now see what a bot is, or someone who's writing fake script in some way. It reads horribly. Yeah. Terrible spelling.
That technology is getting pretty good.
Yeah.
So there's a whole other thing that we have to worry about.
I know, deep fakes.
In the next presidential election.
We've just gone over an hour, so I want to jump into some shorter, fast questions. But before we do that, just quickly, I was curious. I actually came across the B&T magazine 30 Under 30 interview like 10 years later. But it had me thinking about like how do you goal set? How do you aim for things? Are you looking at it from a systems approach, or do you have actual goals that you set out every quarter or year? How does it work for you?
I think you asked me about this last time, and
I was looking for it, but I don't think I could find anything.
All right.
I know that you use script editing.
Yeah.
And you pretty much just dump all your notes, but I don't think we ever got into how you actually goal set.
Right. I goal set by referring to one of my favourite humans on the planet, Brian Eno.
Okay.
Who says he doesn't really set goals. He just sees where sees where he's useful and tries to do that.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of people that sort of Brian Eno has that attitude, and Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller had the great idea of look around and see what needs doing that you think you can do that nobody else is doing. And I recently actually heard. I can't remember his name. He's got a great name though. The founder of Shopify. I heard
the Tim Ferriss episode.
Yeah, I heard an interview with him where he talked about the idea that success was just being useful.
Yeah.
And I really like that. I mean, I think that if I have a goal, then my goal is to be useful.
Yeah. Toby Lutke, I think is his name.
Toby Lutke. Such a good name.
That was episode 359, from snowboard shop to $1 billion company. Yeah, I know that you mentioned Brian Eno, but I just, for some reason, I didn't think about how that works out as a goal. So it just seems like you literally go with the flow. For me, as a very conscientious person, that makes me queasy.
Makes you anxious, doesn't it?
Yeah, very anxious.
Yeah. No, look, I think it's not a goal. The goal is to understand where you're being useful and how you can do more of that.
Yeah.
Which I think sometimes does result in me doing sort of longer term things, but sometimes results in me going with the flow.
Yeah, longer term things are always better. All right, questions to finish us off that I have for you. First one.
I should have thought about the billboard question, shouldn't I?
I know.
Damn.
Did we asked that last time?
Yeah,
so I don't get to ask it again.
Yeah.
What's a quote that you live your life by or think of regularly?
We should be careful to make a world that we actually want to live in.
Okay. Do you know who that's by?
It's by a guy called Rich Gold.
Okay.
It's from a book called The Plenitude.
Okay.
And Rich Gold was sort of an artist, technologist / hippie, I think.
I like that. It's a good one. What does your exercise routine look like? What do you do for all of that?
I cycle a fair bit. I cycle when I can in the mornings. If I don't have time, I'll go for a run.
Yeah.
If I want to just have a bit of a nap. I don't go for a run.
Yeah.
And on weekends, I go for like hour-long walks with my wife.
Okay, like that. Someone fanging in the background. Last question for you. What frustrates you that society is not able to find middle ground on?
The concept of left and right politics.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I was watching a piece by Friendly Geordies about this recently. And what would you prefer that they frame it by?
Yeah, well, that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, right versus wrong, authoritarian versus libertarian.
No. I feel like at least there should be recognition that it's a triangle and there is a moderate side to politics as well.
Yeah, I've started hearing people like Josh Zepps talk about the radical centre.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued by that at the moment. Nic, thanks again.
Thank you.
Where can people find you? Blonde3?
Blonde3, where I've stopped publishing an email, so there's that. There's a failure there. But please go and sign up for the email, and if a whole bunch of people sign up for the email, I will kick it off again.
I will have to do it. You're not on social media anywhere these days.
I'm on LinkedIn. I interestingly, I don't find LinkedIn super valuable. But I've worked out you can just unfollow people, so I've started unfollowing all these random people I actually don't know. And that's starting to get more valuable. But interestingly, I just find that I get a lot of engagement on LinkedIn, and I get mostly intelligent sort of comments and conversations. So I do actually still try and post the odd bit on LinkedIn.
I like that. Yeah, LinkedIn's amazing when it comes to attention at the moment, and just people engaging you around thoughtful discussions.
The numbers are insane.
Yeah.
The numbers are just amazing of I posted a thing the other day, and I just looked before I came in. It had 40,000 thingies. I don't know what the thingies are. Views or something.
Yeah.
And sadly, it wasn't a terribly deep, impactful piece of content. And the reason I was looking up the number was because I posted a brilliant George Dyson essay, which is honestly one of the best things I've sort of read this year. And it had 300 views, and a slightly snarky sort of post about those electric scooters got like 40,000.
Of course. Those things look good. They look like I've never tried it, but they look like a bit of fun.
Yeah, if anyone runs into me in one of those things, I'm gonna they're in trouble.
You'll smack them down. Nic, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.
Bye. Thank you for making it to the end. Before you run off, we need your help to grow this audience. Subscribe on your podcast app. Subscribing will give you priority access and help your fellow-minded listeners find Uncommon, or consider sharing this with a friend who you think would enjoy these sorts of episodes, and this will go a very, very long way in helping us build the audience. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and Twitter, or consider subscribing on YouTube as well. You just need to search for Neural, Neuraalle, or consider following us on Instagram as well by searching Uncommon, UNCOMMON. But until next time, thank you so much for listening.